Right. I think we're ready to get started. So, hello everyone, and welcome to today's ATP webinar, No One Left Behind, Building Resilient Test Delivery. I'm Kimberly Swygert at NVMe, and I'm the current chair of ATP's AI Technology and Assessment Committee, or ATAC. So I just want to thank you all so much for joining us today. So we'll give you a brief introduction to ATAC, and then we also have some audience poll questions to kick things off about how your organizations are preparing for testing day issues. The polls do use a QR code, so please get your phones out or be ready to type in the Slido URL when it comes time to do those questions. And we'll then start the discussion with Drew Wiley, a founding partner of ACS Ventures, who will lead us in discussion of real-world test delivery incidents and the lessons they offer. Next, Mark Molenaar, the founder of Ape.Mise, will connect those lessons to the ATP and ICT guidelines for technology-based assessment and show how programs can build resilience across the testing lifecycle. And we'll close with final thoughts and Q&A. So I'm joined as a facilitator by Leslie Thomas of Criterion, who is ATAC's vice chair. And we would also like to take this time to thank John Kleeman, former ATAC chair and current RAA co-chair, for his contributions to the development of this webinar. Namely, he's the one that came up with the idea for it. So it's exciting to finally see it come to fruition. So if you're not familiar with the ATAC, this committee began in 2022 as the Technology-Based Assessment Committee. Its initial focus was promoting the guidelines for technology-based assessment and encouraging best practice in the use of technology across assessment modalities. In 2024, we formed the Responsible AI and Assessment, or RAA, subcommittee. That group has since developed several resources offering practical guidance for the responsible use of AI in assessment. All of these materials are available through ATP's publication resources page, and you see that URL here. And we encourage you to download them. We'll give you another reminder about them at the end, and we'd love to hear your feedback about them. So now, as promised, the poll, because we'd like to learn a little bit about your program's experience and preparedness. So there will be 3 poll questions that will each be open for 1 minute. So please respond to them based on your program's current experiences. And the purpose of doing this polling is to help all of us see the range of challenges and readiness that's represented in this room. So here is the first question. Has your program faced a major test delivery disruption in the last 2 years? Please choose the response that best reflects your experience and think broadly about disruptions. So anything that you would be, yeah, that was really an issue, that had a lot of impact, that was something we had to react to, you can count that as a disruption. The nice thing about the Slido polls is that you can see them update in real time. And I think we are seeing majority yes. Although it seems to be evening up a little bit now. We have 94, 95 participants in the room, so this is a decent sample. Although to be fair, if you're attending this workshop, maybe you were already planning to say yes to this type of question, so those 2 things could be correlated. Okay, so we'll leave it at that. 50% yes, the rest divided between no and unsure. So our second question, which failure type would be most concerning for your program? And you may find all 3 of these concerning, but please choose the one that would create the greatest risk or the biggest negative impact in your particular context. This is interesting. Looks like security incident is coming out as the clear winner, as the one that's most concerning. Perhaps not surprising. And then finally, the third question, does your program have a documented disruption response plan? So please answer based on whether there is a plan that is currently explicit and documented, not just an informal plan or one where things are handled case by case. Okay. Um, this is interesting. For those, yes, and it's been tested, that number 32%, that was lower than people who said they had a incident in the past 2 years. So that's kind of interesting. But hopefully this gave you a little bit of context for what everyone in the room about their particular programs and the experiences they've had. So at this point, I'll turn it over to Drew Wiley to begin with real world incidents.
Thank you, Kimberly. I appreciate that. And I appreciate the opportunity to come in and speak with all of you regarding this issue, because I do think it is certainly a topic that's absolutely critical, but I think it has a tendency to be overlooked within our community, kind of broadly speaking. I mean, we saw with those numbers right there, approximately one-third of folks in the room indicating that they do not have a proactive plan for a testing disruption. And I think, as Kimberly was saying, I think we've got some selection effect going on here, and presumably the folks who are in the room are a little bit more attuned to see these type of issues. And if we're still seeing about a third of folks not having any type of planning in place, it kind of indicates one of the reasons why we're engaged in this conversation, because kind of at the heart of this topic that we're talking about today is trying to get ourselves better prepared and more proactively prepared for testing disruptions when they were to occur. So just kind of jumping down, when we start thinking about testing disruptions, we start thinking about kind of three broad buckets that we can kind of talk about, and that were kind of included in our poll, where we talk about technology outages, where we can have something as simple as internet failure at a given testing center where things go down, things get overloaded, are unable to keep up with it. There are malicious attacks that can happen. You can have a DDoS attack where people try to flood the zone, if you will, and try to kind of take over the delivery system so that nothing else can happen. And so these technology outages can happen for a variety of reasons. A number of years ago, I was working with a state Department of Education in the United States, and one of the reasons they had a significant disruption was a DDoS attack. And so the administration of their assessments was happening, started on a given date. Everyone in the state knew it. And there were some malicious actors out there who kind of came in and flooded the zone and basically just overwhelmed their test delivery engine to such a degree that students were unable to actually get in and take the assessment. And so you can have just that flooding of the delivery engine that can happen. The other broad area, and we saw obviously this was one that popped up as being kind of the most critical from people's perspective, is the idea of a security incident. So the thing that we usually think about here is we think about candidates actively harvesting items, either going into the test fully prepared to kind of come in and take the test, and kind of walk out the door and immediately post item content up on a website or share it with friends. And so there's a lot of different ways these security incidents can happen. And then the last one that we listed here is the data integrity issues, where we can have things kind of pop up where programs are unable to access the full range of data for a variety of reasons. So it could be that there was an outage, the data does not get delivered appropriately, or there's something systematic in the data, and so certainly that can become problematic as well. So when we start thinking about these type of issues, One of the things that the guidelines is encouraging people to think about is working through the assumption that disruptions will happen. And so making sure that we don't kind of, I think it is certainly worthwhile for us to be spending as much time and effort as possible trying to prevent these disruptions from happening. And so in no way, shape, or form are we trying to say that that's not important. But what we're saying is part of that, in addition to working to try to prevent all of these things from happening, we're encouraging you to think about and try to be more proactive about what you will do to do that. So let's talk a little bit more, though, about what happens when disruptions happen and the impacts on both the candidates as well as for the testing programs. When we start thinking about the testing candidates, obviously in a licensure or certification situation, the disruption for candidates can be immense. You can have situations where people are unable to practice. You have situations where people have just finished school. Their school loans are going to kind of kick in. They graduated in May. They take a test in June. School loans are going to kick in July, and now they're unable to practice. If you're in a situation where if there is a significant testing disruption and candidates are not simply able to go in and take a test again, or you have enough data where you're able to kind of interpolate and get to that, that disruption on candidates can be absolutely enormous. And the stress of that can become extremely difficult and makes it more challenging for candidates as they're kind of going through this process. And certainly for programs, this can have enormous impact on them as well, where people will obviously start to question the integrity of your overall testing program. One thing I can say for sure is what ends up happening, and I think this happens in particular if you have a kind of a more prominent testing program, and if there is a testing disruption that happens, what'll end up happening is, so we were working with a state a little while ago. They had some significant testing disruptions. There was a fairly prominent and well-known program, and what ends up happening is there's kind of a pile-on effect, if you will, where because they had an issue with this one location, all of the critics of this testing program kind of seized on this opportunity, I'll say. And anytime the media was writing about it, they would go to these prominent critics and talk to them about it. And it was an opportunity to question the overall program across the entire board. And so it was no longer limited to simply this one issue that happened, but instead you had people kind of saying, hey, look, not only is it a bad testing program, they're not able to do this, but look at all these other things. And so you had this cumulative effect where articles were being written not solely about the one issue that occurred, but across the overall testing program. So the hit to the organization's reputation was quite dramatic to think about. So let's talk about a little bit more about some of the lessons learned that we're looking at when we start thinking about what kind of issues people run into and some things that kind of will hopefully help us as we start thinking about trying to be more proactive. And as I kind of said already, one of the things that we're encouraging people to do is think about this as not when or if it is going to happen. To be prepared no matter what, at some point, almost every testing program will run into an issue like this. And so to kind of simply believe that you'll be kind of immune to it will become a big problem for you when a problem does occur. And so I think having some sort of activity, having some sort of plan is absolutely essential. However, I don't think just having a plan is appropriate. And I think probably what's going to end up happening today, I'm going to predict here, is if we are successful and we're able to convince people that they need to be a little bit more proactive in their planning, someone's going to walk away from this webinar. They're going to go into the office or they're going to go into their virtual office and they're going to ask someone to go through and say, hey, I just came from this webinar. They had a really good point about this more proactive planning for real world incidents that might happen. So let's go through and do that. They ask their kind of colleague, their trusted deputy to go through. They go through and they create a really nice, rigorous plan. They maybe even present it to a committee who are responsible for the test administration. And now they've got this. But then what ends up happening is that piece of paper or that document, that plan, gets put into a nice little folder over here and completely forgotten. And so I think there's a tendency for organizations to maybe say, hey, yeah, we do have a plan, but damn, I don't remember what we did with it. Or the person who created that plan was here about 5 years ago, and they're no longer even here, and we've kind of lost track of that. And so, just having a paper plan is certainly it's a step in the right direction, but one thing that we encourage you to do is be a little bit more proactive about reviewing that plan, talking about that plan, going through some exercises with it in the event that disruptions were to occur. A few other things to kind of highlight as we go through. And certainly, I think if anyone's had a testing disruption, you've seen this where social media will know before you do. We were working with a group in Canada not too long ago, a large licensure examination. Candidates were posting about testing disruptions before the organization even knew about it. And so things were popping up on Facebook in group chats. A lot of these certification exams, licensure exams have group chats around Reddit and things like that. And things were popping up on there before we even heard directly from the test delivery vendor. And so keeping track of that and being aware that social media will go and run with this immediately. And the other thing about that is it's not necessarily going to be 100% accurate. It's social media, and we all know how that works. And so they're going to be going through and throwing out examples. They're going to be making it sound maybe worse than it is. And so that kind of can kind of take on a life of its own as you're kind of going through the process. One of the other challenges that this group in Canada ran into when they were going through is that our testing disruptions were not consistent. And so I'm old, I've been doing this a long time, and I can remember kind of incidents where testing failure happened at a given testing center, and no one in the testing center could get access to anything. And in some ways, that's actually a little bit easier to deal with because at least you've got some consistency. What we were experiencing with this other group, though, was like half the people in a given testing center could get access and were able to take the exam, but another half weren't. And some people were able to get through some items, but not all of them. And so it was very, very inconsistent. And so when you start running into kind of some internet bandwidth issues, you have situations where the candidates are not going to have consistent disruptions. And so that just makes things so much more difficult because now you've got to deal with all of those different possible iterations and in some ways kind of help those candidates work their way through this process. A couple other things just to mention, but I want to make sure that I give Mark plenty of time to go through his work as well. Making sure that you have kind of a clear line of communication is absolutely essential. And making sure that everyone knows who is that clear line of communication and kind of getting people to be aware of it right away. And so whoever the spokesperson is, make sure everyone knows that that person is the spokesperson and that's the only person who should be speaking to any incidents that happen. Just a quick kind of note about that regarding kind of a spokesperson. My company had the pleasure of getting popped up in a few different media stories not too long ago. We had a couple Reddit chats that kind of talked about my little company as we kind of went through. We remained silent, kind of let those things kind of take off. But I happened to be talking to somebody on our team not too long ago, and she was talking about how hard it was for her not to jump in there because she felt like our company was being treated unfairly and being portrayed unfairly. And she really wanted to go in there and kind of defend the honor of our company. Fortunately, she did not because you really don't want to kind of jump in and have everyone kind of getting in there. And certainly the chats on Reddit are not an area for sophisticated technical talk about what is going on in there. So making sure that you have an identified spokesperson, they're able to kind of get in front of this right away, and making sure that other people are aware that they should not be jumping in to any of those conversations as well. Another critical issue, and I think this is something that we want people to be thinking about, in particular when you're thinking about maybe signing up your test delivery vendor and working with them, is thinking about the data that you will need when you go through and you start working through any kind of testing disruptions. And this is something that really we try to encourage people to think about as they're thinking about a contract with them and kind of looking at all the contingencies that are in there. But kind of working previously with the State Department of Education, one of the things that they struggled with because they had a significant testing disruption, they were not always able to understand where students were in the process of taking the assessments. And the problem was the data was kind of locked away in a log file somewhere that people could not get access to, or it was in a log file that was so unfriendly that it was almost impossible to work with. And so thinking about the data that you will need and being able to get that data from your test delivery vendor is something that's absolutely critical for you to think about. And you want to have that locked away well before any incidents happen. And you should be talking about that during the process of lining them up, setting up your initial contract, and those type of things. The last kind of lessons learned that I'll talk about is when you're going through, I mentioned that different candidates can end up having different types of testing disruptions. And that, for me, at least, has been one of the biggest challenges that I've encountered when people run into these issues, because the fix that gets done over here in Test Center X, or for these candidates who have a given test incident, might work for them, but have you introduced the possibility of it now not being fair? And so you're giving them an unfair advantage. And so if you're trying to kind of recover and trying to do what you can for someone who's had an unfortunate incident, are you kind of overcorrecting? And are you creating a situation where you're treating them over and above how you're treating everybody else? And so sometimes these processes will go through, and if you haven't kind of thought through all of the downstream impacts, sometimes that can lead to even further challenges later on as you're going through the process. So those are some of the things that we kind of identified as critical lessons learned. But I want to hand it off to Mark, because really I think Mark's got the critical role here of talking about what we want to be doing moving forward and looking at what type of plans we can make to help us all be better prepared for these type of incidents. So with that, I'll hand it off to Mark.
All right, thank you. All right, so yeah, I think I've heard a lot of I would say familiar things so far, and issues which have happened in the past. For those of you who don't know me, which are probably a lot of you, my name is Mark Molenaar, and I've worked with CITO, the Netherlands, which is the national test provider there. So they do large scale national assessment. And after that, I worked for TAU, which is an open source assessment platform, which has been used both for national large scale assessment, mostly in Europe, but also for large licensure programs in the US. So I hope I can speak from both the, I would say, institutional side, so from I would say the test publishers, from the CITOs and stuff, and also from the vendor perspective. And obviously, you always want to work together in partnership, but there's different angles to it. And I'll try also to speak both to the technology of it, and I would say more the logistics of it, right? More the process of it. But yeah, we'll see how that goes. So if we can go to the next slide. It's mainly three things I'm going to talk about. First, it's about preparation, obviously, right? Failing to prepare is preparing to fail. That is, I would say, most crucial, and you have to do your utmost for the candidates and for everyone involved to make sure that you do not have incidents, right? That incidents do not happen. So that's one part of it. Second, obviously, detect or monitor, I would say, detect and respond. So during testing sessions, always know what's happening, right? Like Drew just said, you want to know where candidates are, right? Have candidates started, have schools started, have other organizations started, have different sites already started. You want to know where you are. And there are, I would say, good technological means to do that and have a good overview of where people are. And then last, but definitely not least, it's about recovery, remediation, analysis. So after I would say after everything is said and done, after all the tests have been handed in or not, right? In some cases, what do? Right? You want to keep learning. You could always say, you can even make this a cycle, right? So after recovery and remediation, you want to feedback, you want to have that feedback loop into your preparation, right? So once you have completed a campaign or a program or a test, you can have different modes here. You want to pick everything that you learned from it and put it into your preparation for the next one, right? Or a continuous one. So these are the three, I would say, main steps on a high level. And now I'll go into each of them in a bit more detail and provide some examples. One thing to note here, I'm talking both, like I said, both from national large-scale assessment, so like final exams, etc., and licensure. So sometimes it may be a bit mixed, but I'll try to keep them separate. Identify risks upfront. Obviously, this is a very important one. And as you note also in this slide here, these little numbers on every bullet point, these are references to the actual guidelines, right? So like I said, this session is about the guidelines. This is where it all comes from, right? Here we're going to give you an overview, but everything we're saying here is basically what's written down in the guidelines. It's mostly chapter 3, but I must say chapter 3 also needs to be read in conjunction with chapters 6, which is on data management, 8, which is on security, 9, which is about data privacy, and 10, which is about accessibility. So it's not just about test disruptions here, right? So test disruptions feed into, I would say, a lot of the other guidelines. So please make sure, if you haven't done so, to read them in full. And here you could say this is sort of an appetizer, right? An appetizer for the guidelines to check them out in full. And as these are guidelines, you won't find very strict, I would say, it's not really dictating how you should solve things, right? It's not about dictating solutions or how vendors should implement their systems. It's not that way, right? These are more guidelines, again, for both the vendors and the institutions to take into account, just so you don't forget about them and know that they happen. So identify risks up front, right? Make sure that you know what the risks are, and that you also know that, like, the number of candidates involved, the spread on when they might be able to log in or not. Write the plan up front, right? I was happy to see that there's actually quite a few of you who have actually done or have actually made a disruption recovery plan. So that's, I would say, that's great. That's, I think, good statistics to see. But it's always better to find them, to fine tune them, and keep coming back to them. Rehearse it. You can see this in both ways, right? Rehearsing from I would say from a vendor technology perspective is also about piloting and stress testing and simulations. And the hard thing here, and I always make the comparison with, because it's still fresh in memory, soccer penalty kicks, right? Or penalty shootouts, right? It's very difficult. Some people say, at least, it's very difficult to prepare for a penalty shootout because the exact circumstances are always different in real life, right? And the Dutch, so I'm from the Netherlands, we have, I could say, a real penalty shootout trauma, where we only win 20% of penalty shootouts and lost again in the last World Cup, but I won't go into that. But there's always critics who say, well, you cannot train for penalty shootouts, right? It's a casino, anything can happen. And you could argue that simulating the real thing, especially in like national large-scale assessment, is very difficult to do. And we've had also issues in the Netherlands, or we had programs where indeed it is difficult to simulate 200,000 students and just rely on synthetic benchmarks. So what we ended up doing, for example, is mixing synthetic benchmarking. So these would be a server spinning up fictitious end users and then mixing it with actual test takers, because we cannot ask the whole country to participate in a stress test, but we can ask a couple schools to do so. So we try to, again, coming back to the penalty shootout analogy, we try to get as close as we could to the real thing, acknowledging that it's not the same thing. But again, you have the obligation, I would say, to your test takers, first and foremost, to do your utmost, right? To make it as authentic as possible to do so. Yeah, and I hope so that the next, I would say, Dutch head coach will also do this for penalty shootouts, but we'll never know. One thing which is also important here is it isn't just about vendors, right? Obviously, there's also a lot to be said about the participants or participating locations, organizations, schools, etc. And what we ended up doing also in the Netherlands is sort of schools who would want to participate also had to go through sort of a certification process where they had to use special tools we created to sort of certify themselves, that they can prove that they have the bandwidth, that they have the sufficient hardware, infrastructure to actually participate in the testing process. And if they couldn't, they actually had to put some fail-safes in place. They had to, for example, set up local server infrastructures, etc. So they had to go through some additional hoops to sort of be applicable to actually participate in the test taking process first and foremost. So this is an important thing. It isn't just about vendors, right? And in many cases, it's also about the I would say the end users, the organizations, the sessions, to make sure that they can actually handle the load on their end. Contract for resilience, also an important thing. In many cases, you're working with a lot of vendors, and all of them need to be prepared, right? Not just one of them. One example I can also mention is that, for example, on some large-scale assessment programs we did across Europe, we had to contact Amazon upfront that we were going to do a session, because the characteristics of a large-scale national assessment do look a lot like a DDoS attack, coming from 200,000 students at the same time from different schools, etc. So first and foremost, we had to be in contact with them, contract with them, so that they were prepared. We also had to scale up, I would say, infrastructure upfront and not wait for autoscalers to respond because they would be too late. And also be able to scale down when the peak drops to save cost, which is also an important thing. So these kinds of things, especially, like I said, dealing with national large-scale assessment, with everyone logging in at the same time in different locations, maybe throughout the country, it's very important to have everyone, I would say, everyone ready and be ready to cover for it. What also happens, obviously, if you have these large, or I would say high-profile testing sessions, and this also happens for licensure, is that there also can also be of interest for people who want to disrupt things, right? So we had an example where a student, and it's very easy nowadays, just bought a DDoS attack, right? He bought a DDoS attack. I think it consisted of fridges from China or something. So it was a very, very large stream. And then obviously you need your cloud provider typically who can do a protection for that, like a CloudFront or other means. So all cloud providers have it, but you need to be able to set these things up in the beginning. And this is also part of the identifying of risks up front. And design to fail gracefully. Obviously, this is a thing also in IT, graceful degradation. You want to have your fail safes in place. So in national assessment, we usually had like 3 levels of fail safe, where we had data on device, data on local network, and then data on central servers. And these would work in tandem, so that if one of them failed, we could still continue, because that was always our thing. The test must go on. That was always our thing. We want to make sure that the test experience can continue. Yeah, please do the next. All right, so this is the need about what I just said. The test must go on, right? During the administration, what do you do? Well, obviously, you need to monitor, right? You need to monitor in real time. You need to know where people are, right? Where students are. But monitoring, I would say, already starts before the first test taker starts, right? Like I said before, with these sort of pre-checks for locations, we would already know which locations were, I would say, ready, right? We would know whether they pre-qualified to actually participate in the session. So that's already one given. And we would already know from administration how many students would be coming, etc. So we would already know a lot before the actual test, before the first test taker would start. So that's one thing. And then obviously you want to track any usage, right? So any usage during the test taking process, you want to know indeed where students are. One thing we did also is for example, separate out different data streams, right? Some data streams which you definitely want to keep, right? Like results, right? You never want to lose a result. And then we would have process data, right? Which would be more fine-grained data on indeed location of student, etc. Which again, you don't want to lose it, but if it's not available in real time, it's okay, right? So already defining different data streams and sort of classifying them, and also putting the risk on the different data streams was a very crucial one. So we put in a concept called, and I think probably all vendors have them, like a heartbeat system, where we would get like a little tick of data from a student over time, so that we would know whether they would still be active. And then again, if we would not get a heartbeat at a certain point in time, it would not be a disaster immediately. The only thing we would know, okay, we lost connection with this student at this particular time, but there's no disaster yet, right? But at least we would know. So again, these kinds of little bits of information help in signaling and indeed in monitoring when things might go wrong. And last, indeed, on this one, messaging to candidates, right? So when things do go wrong, which you can never prevent 100% of times, you want to communicate with them directly, right? So this could mean from already the testing system, right? That you have also here templates already set up with basically your what you would have on your TV screen if there's a TV interruption. You want to have these screens already done for, I would say, most known or possible errors that might occur. And again, give them information directly, so that they don't need to find out, like Drew said, through Reddit channels or Facebook pages before you would contact them, because that's obviously not a good situation to be in. All right, last one, also looking at the time. Like I said, once the tests have been completed, you're not done yet, right? Again, from a technology perspective, you do something called like a post-mortem. I always find it a bit of an eerie expression, but you want to look into the situation. How did everything go? Was the infrastructure okay? How was the load? Were our predictions okay, right? Were they as expected? Were there big differences from what we were expecting? Why were there differences? And also obviously the errors that happened. Anchor to the test purpose. This is, I think, an important part. Again, it's not about the technology only, right? That's just a factor of it. And especially candidates couldn't care less about technology, right? It's about the purpose of the test, why they're taking the test, and everything needs to be, I would say, in line with the test purpose. Also, what's considered graceful degradation or not, right? So what's still I would say allowable degradation, what's still allowable loss of fidelity. There's no one, I would say, level for it, right? It could differ from one testing program to the next, right? Again, like we said, we always want to have the test continue, right? And then check for errors also later. So if something occurs, we would want to know about it, or we would know about it, and then remediate it later. And remediation can also be, coming to the last bullet on this slide, it can also be something you could then handle in norm setting procedures or scoring processes. We've had incidents, for example, with items where a portion of candidates weren't able to view a video, right? And then because of that, they couldn't answer the items. But again, like I think Drew also mentioned this, but then other students would be able to view the video and answer the items. So what do you do, right? So, and again, this is not, I would say, one size fits all, right? You always need to take into consideration the exact circumstances, what happened, etc. We used to call these calamity items, or call them calamity items. And then you could do multiple things, right? You could just consider these I would say, two groups as separate groups and set separate norms. You could declare an item, a calamity item for everybody, right? And then award everyone points or no one points. So there's a lot of solutions for it. It's not a solution, it's more of a remediation. And again, as long as it's fair for everybody. And again, there's no one size fits all. And this is typically where you obviously get your psychometricians involved and your test experts involved to also here in a communication effort to make sure that it's fair for everybody. That's the main thing. All right. And all right, last slide for me. Again, it's sort of a balancing act, right? This, and again, there's no how you balance it depends from program to program, the stakes involved, the scale of it. It's different for everybody. Candidate experience, to me, this is always the pivotal thing. For me, this also, and again, this is a link to another chapter in the guidelines on accessibility. Sometimes I would say things which are important for security, like lockdown browsers, can have an impact on accessibility. And you always want to balance it, right? Because you don't want to, I would say, throw security out of the door for the sake of candidate experience. So you need to be very, very thoughtful on how you're going to handle these things. And there's no one way to do it. Transparency versus legal. This is a tricky topic, right? You want to be transparent, well, not overly transparent, I would say, especially in the US. So you need to be careful in what you say, right, and how you express it, and maybe get some lawyers involved as well, right? Let's be clear about that. So again, transparency is very important for the students. You want to be fair, but you also need to keep the other aspects in mind. And again, it's a balancing act. You want to respond quick, like Drew said, and get involved in Reddit discussions, but sometimes it's better not to, right? And that's the important thing. All right, I think I'm going to hand it over to Leslie now.
Thank you, Mark. Great information, both Drew and Mark. So just kind of some closing ideas or remarks. As Drew said, resilience is designed in, not bolted in. So it cannot be an afterthought. You've got to plan before it happens. As he said, it's not a question of, if it's going to happen, it's a question of when it's going to happen. Really that preparation is really key. I thought one of the things he said was really interesting is that disruptions impact candidates differentially. And that oftentimes, if you fix something for a group of candidates, it may have unintended consequences in terms of being unfair for the other candidates. And so that's something that you really need to think about. You really want to put that fairness piece of it really front and center. You also want to test everything, as he said, a plan on paper isn't really a plan. It's setting yourself up to potentially fail. You've got to go through and rehearse it. And another piece that the rehearsal really helps with is making sure that it's going to work the way you think it's going to work. Because as we all know, a lot of times things in theory are great, but in practice, they work differentially. So it helps you really, iron out any of the kinks, because you don't want to be figuring that out, in the middle of the process. Of course. And then, as Mark was going through, there's a playbook out there already. Kimberly had put in the guidelines, the link to it, but there are a number of chapters that are very applicable that explain, how to really approach this whole planning process and all the things you need to think about. I'm sure a lot of those chapters have come out of people's real world experiences as they've gone through this. So it's always better to learn these lessons from others than learning them yourself in practice. So definitely take a look at those guidelines. And then, last but not least, when you're doing this, to get started, because if you come up with a plan, it can seem a little bit overwhelming, but just pick parts of the plan and start small. And go through and, start picking one of those risks that might happen, as we mentioned at the very beginning, whether it's some sort of technology outage whether it's a security issue, something along those lines. Go through your playbook, pick one, maybe once a quarter, go through and rehearse and make sure, because that rehearsal, I know in my own experience, is really, really important, because there will be changes in the organization, who calls who has the authority, and those types of things. And you just want to make sure it's top of mind, because if things don't go as planned, if it's more rehearsed, it'll become more second nature to everybody. And that's really, really important in those situations. So again, great information. Next slide, please. And now we have some time here for questions and answers. And I'm looking in the question and answer box here. It looks like the one question was as to where you could find the guidelines, which again, that link is in there.
Yes, so please, if you have other questions during this time, please go ahead and type them into the Q&A. If you can't find the Q&A, go to the More circle at the bottom that has 3 dots and click on it, and that will pull up the Q&A for you. And I also just want to say, for Leslie mentioning the risk issue that you did just now, also one thing to think about is that sometimes at the organizational level, risks can get siloed out into different departments. So perhaps IT is supposed to worry about this, and this group is supposed to worry about this. And especially when it comes to testing day disruptions, it can be helpful to have someone who is looking at those overall to ensure that the groups that need to be working together closely are in fact doing so, and you don't have a scenario where if something goes wrong, you have one department that's listed as being in control of that risk or being able to do something about it, but in fact that department would need to be working closely with several other departments to make it happen. So that is one thing to look out for. It might even be better to start with the high level, here's everything we think can go wrong during a testing day, and then go down from there to really be able to document and list out your control activities with all the players involved that you need.
Yeah, I think that's a very important one. You need to have that response team, right? And have them ready, right? It's not, again, it's not if. You need them ready. You need to have them in a room already, right? You don't want to assemble them once something happens, right? You want to have them ready to respond, and you need not just IT folks, because IT folks have different priorities, they have different angles. Also have the business folks at the table, and they need to come up with solutions together, right? Because what's good for one, right? IT would say, we need to fix it now, right? But then business might say, well, actually, that might introduce an unfairness in the situation, right? So what are we going to do? So that's, I would say, very, very crucial.
Yeah, I was going to say, just building on Mark's, I found that in experience that having that diverse group of perspectives is really, really important, because there oftentimes are unintended consequences to going down a particular path. And you've got, as he's saying, like IT is going to think about things in a very certain way, but they're not going to think of it perhaps from a psychometric fairness perspective. And so, it's getting that whole group together to kind of think through, what are the different, this happens, what are we going to do? And then doing that. And then again, that rehearsal piece is really important, because when you start rehearsing it and you're doing it, then it really puts it, it makes you really, really think through how this is going to work. So each part, the planning and so forth, getting your diverse group of people in there, and then actually, rehearsing those plans just to make sure it's going to work as you intend it to work. So you don't want to find it's not working as you intended on the day that things go wrong.
I just saw an interesting question come in on whistleblowers, right? It's sort of a test content leakage, and I can tell you a bit about that sort of a process in the Netherlands. The good thing is we have the good thing and the bad thing, right? There's a couple sites out there, right? Obviously Reddit is one of them, but there's also these sites where people might try to sell content, right? And what we would do is, before we would get police involved, because that's actually what would happen, we would first need to know whether it's legit, right? Whether the content is actually the content or not. So there's sort of a play there where you have to pretend as a buyer, verify that they actually got content before you could get local authority in place actually to investigate further. So there's processes there too. I cannot disclose everything there, but yeah, you have to be deep in these kinds of also you need groups to know whether these type of things happen. But it's important to do. It's part of the plan. It's part of the plan that these things might happen. Like in the Netherlands, national exams, all schools already got the content weeks in advance, right? So that is a very, very tricky situation to be in. And so far it's gone pretty well. But yeah, you need to have a look out and need tackle it before it gets bigger, right? But it's not an easy thing to do.
And I think, Mark, I think your point about taking the time to kind of verify the content, because what I have seen is that there's a lot of people out there kind of saying that they have material
Exactly.
or claiming
Yeah.
to have material.
Yeah.
And they say, hey, we'll get you licensed, we'll get you certified.
Yeah.
And we've got all of these things, and they kind of are very misleading about it.
Yeah.
You may want to address that separately,
Mhm.
regardless of what they're doing, but then determining whether or not you have kind of copyright infringement and you're able to kind of work through that process is going to be absolutely critical, because obviously once it kind of word starts to spread, the harm there can really, I think the real challenge, what I've seen is with smaller programs there where content is even more valuable, just because they can't necessarily build as many test forms as you would if you've got a robust population of people coming in to get your certificate or get your license. Where I think I've seen people struggle more is with those smaller programs if they encounter that.
Yeah, especially with the item banks, right?
Yeah.
Which you want to continue year over year. Like
Right.
national exams in the Netherlands, it's a matter of we're going to use them once and then they're practice material, right?
Mhm.
So you need to be very, very careful in the moment during that period of time. But it's not like that content's going to be used year over year.
And there's a really interesting question here from Karina that I don't know the answer to, but I can understand why it's being asked about how the guidelines could be adapted when you have, for example, sort of a known instability, like the internet systems being slow or unstable. It seems there like basically your preparedness plan is probably going to need to be a lot more comprehensive and perhaps require some type of investment or other options that perhaps you don't have to worry about. But that feels like a good point to say, depending on your environment, your physical
Yes.
location,
Mhm.
your preparation could look very different from somebody who maybe gives the same type of assessment but is in a different country or a different part of the
Yeah.
world.
True. Yeah, you have to take into account yeah, like I said, national, especially on the country level, the infrastructure available, right? So we've had some situations in countries where there would not be a guaranteed internet connection, and we would work, for example, with local servers, or in some cases, even sort of test centers in a box, right? So an appliance which you would send around, sometimes even with testing devices included, right? So the actual tablets or what have you. So you need to adapt, right, to the circumstance, because they do make things more complicated. Logistics get more complicated, but in some cases you have to, right? Yeah.
And I think one thing that also needs to be thought about is if you know you're going to be launching and you're going to be giving, say, a certification exam in 100 countries, and you know there's going to be internet issues, you should be thinking about that also when it comes to the design of your assessment.
Yep.
So
Yep.
Mark talked about, items with a video. If you're going to be delivering all over the world and you know there's going to be internet issues, video is probably not a great idea. And so kind of overwhelming folks with a very complex test is something maybe you should be reconsidering.
All right, so I think we're at our last 5 minutes here. So just to kind of wrap up things, as Kimberly mentioned, there are a number of publications that are being worked on by the RAA group within ATAC. You can see some of them here: creating responsible and ethical policies for assessment organizations, considerations, the use of generative AI, and then the human oversight paper, which is been very popular. And then we just published Assessment in 2040, Voices from the Field. Really interesting publication. It is basically a number of opinion pieces on what the future of assessment is going to look like. All different opinions, as you can imagine. Really interesting read. So I highly encourage you to go out and look at it. And then, of course, we've also got an AI and assessment glossary there too. So lots of great publications and more to come in the future. And again, that link, we'll be sending out these slides. The link in the beginning of the slides will give you where to go on the resources page on the ATP page if you don't already know where that is. And then we've also got, next slide, in addition, we've got some upcoming webinars. So at EATP, there are a couple of presentations in October. We've got From Transparency to Trust, Communicating AI Use and Assessment. There is a paper coming out probably early next year on AI and transparency and communicating. How do test sponsors communicate with candidates and other stakeholders? And this panel is going to be about that paper and about that particular topic. There's also another one, Vicky, Verified Human Oversight of AI-Based Assessment that they'll be presenting. I know. Human oversight at AI, and that'll be presented at EATP. And then we've also got a webinar coming up in November, December. We try to have 2 to 3 of them per year. And this topic, it's going to be about future facing on AI and assessment. So look forward to that when that's coming out. The dates again, November, December timeframe for that. And then next slide, please. And then here we are. We have information, contact information. In case you think of any sort of questions that come up after the webinar, please feel free to reach out to any of us. And with that, I just want to thank everybody for your time and attending. We know you're all busy. Hopefully you got some great information out of this, and look forward to more webinars in the future. Thank you.
Yes, great. Thank you all so much for attending.